Loyalty Binds Me, The Life of King Richard III, Episode 4. The king entreateth my lord of Clarence for my lord of Gloucester, and as it is said, he answereth that he may well have my lady his sister-in-law, but they shall part no livelihood. Edward IV had won back his crown, ably assisted by his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, an 18-year-old now with 2 victories in battle under his belt. As the dust settled during May 1471, it became clear that there was a whole tangle of legal problems left behind by Henry VI's re-adeption, the brief Lancastrian revival that had sent 2 of the 3 York brothers into exile. Parliament would sit for 44 weeks during the 2.5 years after it was called in October 1472, trying to dissect the mess. The part that Richard would take in shaping his own destiny is not entirely clear from the evidence that we have. Warwick's death left a gaping, Neville-sized hole in Edward's ability to control his realm in the north. There was a lingering chance that such a large faction might coalesce and pose another threat to him, similar to that faced by Henry IV in 1403 when the Percy family tried to take control of the region. The king's youngest brother, Richard, would fill that hole. It isn't certain whether Richard sought out such a valuable reward for his service, or whether Edward needed the gap plugged and saw his brother as the perfect, trustworthy solution to the problem. It's entirely possible, perhaps even likely, but it was a combination of the two. It suited Edward's need for security and Richard's desire to build a future for himself. One person was very definitely not happy with the proposal, and it probably isn't a surprise who that is. George was married to Isabel Neville, the oldest daughter of Warwick. Through her, he could lay claim to the vast Neville inheritance. George's problem was that Isabel had a sister, Anne. She had been married briefly to Edward, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, but with his death at Tewkesbury, in which George is suspected of involvement, Anne had no husband to lay claim to half the Warwick estates. Perhaps that's no coincidence. George was never big on sharing or playing nicely. Richard, it was decided, would marry Anne. That would give him a claim to half the Neville inheritance and put someone up against Clarence capable of holding his ground against the petulant royal duke. As Sir John Paston's letter reveals, George made it clear that Richard might have Anne, but none of the Neville inheritance. There was going to be trouble to get this settled, but settled it must be. In an opening shot, the king gave Richard the office of Great Chamberlain of England that had belonged to Warwick. It was clear whose side Edward would take. The king also began to give Richard key Neville properties in the north, including castles at Middleham and Sheriff Hutton. One possibility that's overlooked in all of this is that the idea for a marriage between Richard and Anne might have come initially from the would-be bride. It's easy to see Richard as either the ruthless, acquisitive nobleman or the romantic hero, and I would suggest that he was a bit of both. But Anne was in a perilous situation herself. She turned 15 in June 1471. She was a widow of a Lancastrian prince, the daughter of a man who died a traitor to the Yorkist regime, and, according to some accounts, a prisoner of her sister and brother-in-law in an effort to prevent her remarrying and claiming her inheritance. If she was looking for a way out, a man who could improve her position and fight her brother-in-law, there was probably no one in the kingdom able to help her but Richard. We can't know whether it was Richard's idea, Edward's, or even Anne's, but we do know that it set the York brothers against each other again in spectacular style. It isn't known with any certainty precisely when Richard and Anne married, but it was probably around May or June 1472. Anne's 16th birthday was the 7th of June that year. The marriage made the issue of a settlement pressing, but didn't solve any of the problems. Technically, the Neville inheritance belonged to George Neville, the nephew of Warwick and son of John Neville, who had died alongside his brother at Barnet. George was created Duke of Bedford but given none of the family lands. Part of the inheritance, most notably the Warwick title itself, had been held by virtue of Warwick's marriage to Anne Beauchamp, and his widow now had her own claim on her family's ancestral lands. Edward's solution was brutally simple. Anne Beauchamp was declared legally dead, so that she had no further claim on her lands and titles. George was given the Beauchamp portion of the Warwick inheritance focused on the Midlands. Richard received the Neville patrimony in the north. George was not, unsurprisingly, very happy. Neither was Anne Beauchamp, but the pair had little foothold from which to oppose Edward's settlement. One odd clause was inserted into Richard and George's title to their wives' inheritance. Quite why both accepted it is unclear, but it would rear its head a decade later in an unexpected and potentially devastating way. Richard was to have, hold, possess and enjoy, to him and his heirs of his body lawfully begotten, all so long as there be any heir male begotten of the body of the said Marquis. To clarify what that meant, the Act added, also, it is ordained by the said authority that if the said issue male of the body of the said John Neville Knight, begotten or coming, die without issue male of their bodies coming, that then the said Duke to have and enjoy all the premises for term of life. Richard's hereditary claim on the Neville lands depended entirely on the continuation of the line of George Neville, Warwick's nephew and heir. If that line failed, Richard's title reverted to a life interest only. It was perhaps a risk no one ever thought would amount to anything, but they would be proven wrong. As Richard settled down to married life, he can hardly have known that his relationship with Anne Neville would be the subject of debate more than 500 years later. We know that Richard had 2 illegitimate children, and it's believed that they were born before this marriage. There's no evidence of other illegitimate sons or daughters, nor of any mistresses kept during his marriage. John of Gloucester and Catherine were acknowledged and provided for by their father. The identity of their mother or mothers isn't known, though there are a few candidates amongst ladies Richard provided financial support to. There have been claims that Richard had other illegitimate children, but it would seem odd that he was happy to acknowledge and support these 2, but would ignore the others. Richard and Anne were blessed with a son during the early years of their marriage. It's often claimed that Edward of Middleham, named for his uncle the king and the place of his birth, was born as early as December 1473, but a date of birth as late as 1476 seems more likely. The boy would spend much of his childhood at Middleham Castle. His governess was Anne Idley, whose husband Peter had written an instructional text on the best ways to raise a boy called Instructions to His Son. It's likely that no expense was spared by his parents as they set about preparing their heir for the future of power and authority that awaited him. Edward of Middleham remains shrouded in mystery despite his high rank and bright future. Like many medieval noble children, he shrinks from the record and can't be seen with any clarity. The uncertainty around his date of birth demonstrates just how little we know about him. The nature of Anne and Richard's relationship is also a source of much debate and spilt ink. For some, it was a love match and the couple were devoted to each other. To others, it was a political arrangement that required no emotion. The truth is, we can never know what really happened behind doors that were closed over 500 years ago. Both extremes quite possibly played some part in their day-to-day lives. Richard had what he gained because he married a rich heiress, but that doesn't necessarily preclude love. Some of the stories that have survived about Richard and Anne tend to support the idea that they were a close couple. The Crowland Chronicler, a writer close to the centre of Yorkist government, who wrote in 1486 and appears on the surface to be anti-Richard, interestingly preserves a romantic tale of Richard rescuing Anne. Crowland explains that George and Isabel were so determined not to share their inheritance that they effectively kidnapped Anne and hid her in the London home of one of George's retainers, putting her to work in the kitchens as a maid. Richard found out where she was being held and broke her free. Rather than abducting her for himself, he instead had her placed into sanctuary at St Martin le Grand in London, suggesting that she was to be allowed some say in her own future. there's no way to be certain whether this story has any basis in truth or is simply a myth, but it's interesting that a generally hostile source should concede such heroic chivalry to the young Richard. After, as already stated, the son of King Henry, to whom the Lady Anne, the youngest daughter of the Earl of Warwick, had been married, was slain at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, sought the said Anne in marriage. The proposal, however, did not suit the views of his brother, the Duke of Clarence, who had previously married the eldest daughter of the same Earl. Such being the case, he caused the damsel to be concealed, in order that it might not be known by his brother where she was, as he was afraid of a division of the Earl's property, which he wished to come to himself alone in right of his wife, and not to be obliged to share it with any person. Still, however, the craftiness of the Duke of Gloucester so far prevailed that he discovered the young lady in the city of London disguised in the habit of a cookmaid, upon which he had her removed to the sanctuary of St. Martin's. I think family life in the north of England with Anne and little Edward must have been a comfort to Richard, something he enjoyed after all the upheavals of his own childhood and youth. It seems likely that the relationship between the Duke and Duchess was happy and effective, even if love can't be proven at this distance. They certainly worked very well together, and filling the gap left by Anne's father in the north of England would be no small task. Richard famously became a well-liked, though not universally loved, but then who is, lord during his time in the north. As he tried to fill Warwick's ample boots and avert a revolt against him as an interloper into the region, offices continued to flow to Richard. On the 18th of February 1472, he was made Sheriff of Cumberland for life, and in May he was appointed Keeper of the Forests beyond the Trent. Both offices gave Richard a substantial and reliable income. Richard also began to receive the wardships of young heirs, like William Walgrave and Henry Marney. They were from knightly families rather than nobility, but measures such as these were designed to help Richard build local links and relationships that would develop ties of loyalty to him over the decades to come. June 1473 saw Richard placed into an awkward position. His brother the King handed him a commission that required Richard to settle the dispute between Lord Stanley and James Harrington over the Harrington inheritance, once and for all. He was to conclude the matter in favour of Lord Stanley against the Harrington family that Richard had defended in 1470. James managed to negotiate the retention of a couple of manors, but was required to hand Hornby Castle, the jewel in their crown, to Lord Stanley. Richard can hardly have enjoyed the task, but he did as his brother instructed. Despite this, Sir James Harrington remained incredibly close to Richard for the rest of their lives. With a Neville bride on his arm and the King's backing, Richard did a good job of drawing the Neville affinity to him. In 1473, 36 men drew fees from the Lordship of Midland, and 22 had previously been in the Earl of Warwick's service. Powerful northern families like the Conyers, the Savills, the Maleveras, Markenfields and Everinghams gravitated toward Richard, finding something appealing in his style of lordship. Maybe that was little more than the fact that as the King's brother, he offered a direct line to the crown, but it also seems that they saw something in Richard that inspired deep and personal loyalty to him. One problem with Richard's arrival was the destruction, again, of the hopes of the Percy family. The Percy Earls of Northumberland had long been local rivals to the Neville family. Warwick's successes had allowed the Nevilles to gain ascendancy at the expense of the Percys. With Warwick's fall, the Earl of Northumberland must have hoped his family would now gain prominence in the north and increase their power and influence. Richard's arrival destroyed those expectations. There must have been some tension between Richard and Northumberland because on the 12th of May 1473, both men were required to appear before a royal council at Nottingham. Northumberland was required to swear to the Duke to be his faithful servant and to do service to the Duke at all times lawful and convenient, as long as it didn't conflict with his duty to the King. In turn, Richard promised to be the Earl's faithful lord. The settlement dashed Percy hopes in the north for the foreseeable future. Northumberland would have to come to terms with his subservience or brood on it until he could do something about it. It's possible that, like Lord Stanley, Henry Percy conceived a dislike of Richard that would prove hard to shake off as long as the Duke threatened and curtailed his family's opportunities. As Lord of the North, Richard was generally very popular, but he made enemies, and even in York, there were some grumblings about his interference in local politics. But you can't please all of the people all of the time.